This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. A cattle market update from Livestock Marketing Information Center's Tyler Cozzens and Brandon Dodd starts the show as they review the recent cattle on feed and cattle inventory reports. Kelsey Andersen Onofre, K-State wheat pathologist, keeps the show moving as she explains wheat-free windows and why they are valuable for wheat growers. Ending the show is K-State Fisheries and Aquatics Extension Specialist Joe Gerken discussing how people can help keep ponds healthy and safe. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Monday show with a cattle market update from Director of the Livestock Marketing Information Center, Tyler Cozzens, and agricultural economist with the Livestock Marketing Information Center, Brandon Dodd. Tyler, Brandon, thank you both so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Tyler, as we start our cattle market update, wanting to start with the July cattle inventory report that we got on Friday, July 25th, and what do we see there?
Yeah, so kind of an interesting thing to bring up there on that July cattle inventory report. Keep in mind here, so this report, we didn't have this report last year. So some of the comparisons are going to be a little bit different comparison comparing over 2 years ago, basically. But kind of by and large, this report it's kind of considered a mid-year update. Kind of detailing the U.S. cattle herd as of July 1, 2025. So the report could provide some insights into potential herd rebuilding efforts that we might be seeing underway or any herd rebuilding efforts that could be on the horizon. But let's kind of jump into the report and kind of what we found there. So kind of ahead of the report, analysts were actually surveyed prior to the report kind of to gauge their expectations, what they might see from the report. And by and large, across the board, lower inventory levels were expected, especially for the beef cattle herd. This was actually, in fact, the case. And actually, some of the lowest levels that we actually saw reported for the July inventory report, actually dating back to the early 1970s. So with that being said, the all cattle and calves number reported from the report was actually down 1.3%, or about 1.2 million head from 2023. And it actually came in at 94.2 million head. The number of cattle was actually slightly higher than the range of pre-report expectations from analysts, which they were expecting all cattle and calves to actually be down about 2% from 2 years ago, with the estimates actually ranging from down about 2.2% to down 1.6%. A couple of other key statistics to note from the report would be beef cows and heifers, beef cow replacements, and the calf crop. So kind of looking at those three numbers there, beef cows and heifers were actually 28.7 million head. That was actually down 1.2% from 2 years ago. This was actually slightly higher than the range of pre-report estimates. Now, on the beef cow replacement side of things, that was down 2.6% from 2 years ago to 3.7 million head. This was also within the range of pre-report expectations. On the calf crop, that was 33.1 million head, which was down 1.4% from 2 years ago. And this was slightly higher than the range of pre-report expectations. So kind of overall, this July report gives us some insights into the inventory levels, but comparisons were a bit tricky, largely just because we didn't have a report to compare to last year. But regardless, on the beef side, inventory levels are down about 1 to almost 3% from 2 years ago, which generally aligns with kind of information that we saw that was actually reported in the January 1 cattle inventory report.
And Brandon, another report that we got this past Friday on July 25th, cattle on feed, and anything valuable in that?
Yeah, so this specific report contained estimates for the month of June, and it also provided a bit of a snapshot for what total inventories look like for on feed as of July 1. So similar to what Tyler mentioned with surveys being conducted with analysts across the industry, we had a similar thing for the cattle report. We had a similar thing for cattle on feed. So from a bird's eye view, the month's report came at a bit of a shock and was not quite in line with analysts' expectations for placements, marketings, and total cattle on feed. Specific for placements, Nash reported roughly 1.4 million head of cattle were placed in feed yards, which was about 92% of what we observed last year. Now, pre-report expectations had assumed placements on feed would be down at maximum levels of 3.2%, but the realization was instead down about 7.9%. For marketings of fed cattle to slaughter, declines were also more severe than what was anticipated from pre-report expectations, and total marketings fell about 4.4% to just over 1.7 million head. Analysts had only pegged marketings to be down max 4.1. So marketings number was a little bit closer than placements, but it was still outside of that range. Now, because both placements and marketings during the month of June were both down more than what was anticipated, this inevitably caused total cattle on feed as of July 1 to also be lower than what was expected. Total cattle on feed was forecasted to be down roughly 1% and or be flat with last year, but the report instead showed that the total number of animals on feed was actually down by about 1.6% to 11.1 million head. Now, to kind of back up here for a minute, during the month of June, a handful of things were going on. One of the most notable were losses in feeder cattle imports from Mexico, which appear to have had more of an impact on placements than what analysts otherwise expected. For placements, especially, a common ticket item analysts keep an eye on are receipts of feeder cattle sold. Now, it's not an exact measure, but during the month, increases were actually observed for receipts. So it's possible that that was a component into why pre-report expectations weren't anticipating as large of a decline. Something also worth mentioning that we noticed in the report is that the number of days on feed that cattle are being kept is continuing to increase as slaughter and marketings continue to decline relative to placements. So in the report, the number of cattle on feed over 150 days actually increased 16% year over year during the month. And when we look at cattle on feed over 180 days, we saw an increase of roughly 45%. The result of these extended feeding periods is continuing to pressure higher weights on some of these cattle, which over the last couple of years we've become all too familiar with, as feeders are continuing to pack on the pounds and attempt to offset some of the losses that we're seeing in the number of head slaughtered and keep beef production somewhat steadily afloat. Now, another piece to discuss here, and this is a bit of a bonus for the report this month, was that we were provided numbers of the mix of steers and heifers that are in feedlots currently. And I say bonus because their values were only provided about once every quarter, so only 4 times a year. Now, total steers and steer calves on feed were clocked in at about 6.9 million head, which is pretty much flat with last year, but up a little bit, but less than 1%. Heifers, on the other hand, had more of a pullback with about 5.5% of a decline, which equates to about 240,000 head. This reported decline doesn't entirely come as a shock, and when cross-referencing the number of heifers on feed relative to inventories, which was actually about 38%, what we're really seeing here is that there hasn't been a dramatic pullback that would otherwise suggest the industry is in a full-blown herd expansion mode. But the losses to placement are definitely a cause to question, since placements are always the statistic on this report that analysts kind of struggle to achieve. So tying back into Tyler's discussion regarding the July 1 inventory numbers, there's still much to keep in mind here and keep an eye out for. But overall, currently the macro and demand level picture is continuing to evolve, and we've yet to see any substantial evidence on the supply side that provides a clear picture into what will unfold for the U.S. cattle herd.
As we are doing our cattle market update, Tyler, what did we see in last week's cattle market?
Yeah, sure. So kind of breaking down some of the market level things that we're seeing in the cattle side of things, looking specifically at the feeder cattle side in the Dodge City, Kansas auction summary report. On the feeder steer side of things, prices were reported for 6 to 7, 7 to 8, and 8 to 9 weights. 6 to 7 weights were $369.54. 7 to 8 weights were $348. 8 to 9 weights were $323. Those were actually up about $3.50 to almost $4 compared to the prior week, and some pretty significant gains compared to a year ago. I mean, we're talking 30 to 46% increases compared to a year ago. So some strong gains there on the feeder side. Heifer side, similar discussion there. 5 to 6 weights were about $370. 6 to 7 weights were $359. 7 to 8 weights were $348. 8 to 9 weights, $299, and then 900 to 1,000 pounds, $313. So those actually increased from the prior week, with increases roughly ranging from about 2% to upwards of 14%. So some pretty strong gains there week over week, and even compared to a year ago. Switching over to the fed cattle side of things, looking specifically at the 5-area average, weekly weighted average slaughter cattle report there on a negotiated basis. Live steers and heifers were basically 237. That's actually up about 1%, about roughly $1 to almost $2 compared to the prior week. Compared to a year ago, actually up 23%, about $44 for both live steers and heifers. So some strong gains to compare to a year ago. On the dressed basis, steers and heifers were 379. That's actually just a slight increase compared to the prior week, but 22% above a year ago, almost $70 compared to a year ago. Now, looking at the box beef cutout value side of things on a negotiated basis, cutout value last week was $370. That's actually down for almost $5 compared to the prior week. A lot of the lower cutout value is driven largely by most of the cutout values as the chuck, round, loin, brisket, short plate, and flank were all down about 1 to 3% compared to the prior week. The only primal cutout value that showed some strength last week was the rib. It was actually up 2%, but compared to a year ago, some strong gains there. So quick note there on the cutout value side of things, not all unexpected to see a decline in that cutout value as we get past the July 4th grilling holiday there, kind of a typical seasonal decline that we often see there from the cutout value side of things. And so I think we're just seeing kind of some of those seasonal changes in demand profiles as we kind of get past the July 4th holiday. See some of that demand profile change a little bit as we get a little bit closer to the Labor Day holiday, first week of September there. So kind of watching that seasonal trend happen there and just play out is what we're seeing. So
Tyler, Brandon, I appreciate you both taking the time to join us today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for having us.
That was Director of the Livestock Marketing Information Center, Tyler Cozzens, and he was joined by an agricultural economist with the Livestock Marketing Information Center, Brandon Dodd. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show discussing volunteer wheat and wheat streak mosaic virus and how a wheat-free window plays into that with K-State wheat pathologist Kelsey Andersen Onofre. Kelsey, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Kelsey, as we've talked about volunteer wheat streak mosaic virus and that virus complex, something that's really important. Can you remind us about it?
Yeah, absolutely. So in this past season in 2025, we did have pretty bad levels of wheat streak mosaic complex throughout the state, right? So Shelby, as a reminder, we don't just have one virus at play. We have 3 viruses: wheat streak mosaic virus, triticum mosaic virus, and high plains wheat mosaic virus. And they're all moved around by the tiny wheat curl mite. So right now, as we're coming into our summer period, our pre-plant period, it's critical to think about that volunteer wheat management strategy.
Kelsey, what is the concept of a wheat-free window?
So thinking about wheat-free windows, this is the period that we're recommending all volunteer wheat be controlled by for the 2025 wheat season, right? So in Kansas, it's going to be very important to take care of that volunteer wheat. Why? Because that's really the place where our curl mites are surviving the summer. So at harvest, we have billions of mites active in the landscape, right? They're looking for somewhere to go. So they're going to have this big migration period right after harvest. Places where we had a lot of volunteer wheat, maybe because harvest was delayed or we had lodging, those are going to be really important places for those curl mites to survive the summer. So a really critical period is right after harvest. If there was any volunteer wheat that was present after harvest, we should consider controlling that. But the next most important period is the period right before planting, right? And that's what we're calling a wheat-free window. That's a period we're recommending all wheat be dead prior to the start of the optimal planting window in the region. So what wheat-free windows are we recommending for Kansas? So we've got this set up by recommended optimal planting date in the state. So, for example, in the northwest part of the state where our optimal planting window starts on September 10th, we're recommending all volunteer wheat be controlled by August 10th. So we have a wheat-free window from August 10th to September 10th in northwest Kansas. As we move into central Kansas, those days move back a little bit. So in central Kansas, we have a wheat-free window from August 15th to September 15th. And as we move into southeast Kansas, we have a wheat-free window from September 5th to October 5th. Now, there's a couple important things to remember about these wheat-free windows. One, this is our opportunity to control volunteer wheat and kill off our mite populations, which are going to be very high going into our 2025 winter wheat planting period. So we want all volunteer wheat to be terminated prior to the start of that wheat-free window by region. Where possible, we should avoid planting winter wheat early, right? So this is a problem. When we plant winter wheat early during that wheat-free window, we're at a high risk of having a bridge crop for those curl mites to make it to neighboring fall established wheat. So for example, if I go in northwest Kansas and I plant September 1st, right, that's going to be a risky crop because it's during that wheat-free window. We should also avoid having other cereals like rye and triticale planted early during that window. Those cereals we know are really good hosts for the curl mite, right? So they can be kind of sneaky bridges for our curl mites to our fall established crop, right? Again, that regional break is very important to allow our mite populations to die off. Now, a question we'll get frequently is what if that volunteer wheat emerges later, maybe closer to the emergence of our fall established wheat crop? Well, that's probably less of a concern, right? Because we've already killed off those mite populations during that period. So again, we're really pushing a coordinated effort to have volunteer wheat really killed off by that wheat-free window here in Kansas this season.
Can the wheat curl mite live for very long if it doesn't have a host?
Yeah, so that's a key concept, right? So those curl mites, they really can't survive more than 4 or 5 days off a living host. So once the host dries down, once the wheat crop is terminated, they need to find somewhere to go within 4 days or they die, right? So these breaks are really important for them to just die off and not be able to complete their life cycle.
If farmers are butted up against a different farmer's field, is it worth maybe chatting with each other so it's a collaborative effort?
For sure. So, that's another piece. We also need to be aware of what's going on around us, right? So this only works well if we have some coordination in communities, right? So if we have volunteer out through that summer period, right, in a neighboring farm, that could be a high risk for our farm. And in that case, we'd want to make sure we select a resistant variety and maybe, have some other options. The other piece is cover crops and fall crops. There might be volunteer hidden in double-cropped milo or sorghum. So, it's good to be aware of what's going on in the landscape around that fall established wheat crop.
If a farmer had wheat streak mosaic virus or something in the virus complex this past year and they've taken all of the steps to erase their volunteer wheat and hopefully kill their wheat curl mites, should they still maybe pick a variety that has good resistance or should it really be taken care of?
So that's really based on what's going on nearby, right? So it is good practice to select a variety that has some resistance to wheat streak mosaic, especially if you have some of these other grass hosts out in the landscape. But again, you have to balance that with yield potential and other agronomic characteristics of a variety, right? So again, prioritize those varieties that have resistance on those acres that are at high risk for wheat streak mosaic. Maybe they're next to volunteer or they're next to an early winter cereal crop. That would be a higher risk scenario.
What is a common mistake or something you really encourage growers to keep in mind when it comes to hopefully trying to control wheat streak mosaic virus or that virus complex for this next growing season?
Well, I think there's some key strategies, right? Delaying that planting outside of these wheat-free windows is going to be really important. I know we're always balancing getting in with moisture, right? We always want to go and plant as soon as we can with a moisture situation, but sometimes that can hurt us, right? So we have to understand that delaying our wheat planting until we get into those optimal windows really is good from a pest management perspective and from a yield perspective as well. The other thing is being careful about, cereal covers and winter covers and their proximity to our fall established wheat, right? They can accidentally bridge some of these these mites to our wheat crop, and that can be problematic. You know, the worst infections that we see happen in the fall, but we don't see symptoms until the spring, right? So I think that'll catch producers off guard, and it did in 2025. We had those infections happen. It looked like we had a good crop. That virus lays dormant there in the plant, and then those symptoms show up in April, right? So I think that can catch us off guard too. So everything we can do really has to happen between now and when we plant our winter wheat in October. After that, there are no more options for managing wheat streak mosaic, right? So this is really our moment to make a difference.
If people want to find out more information about this, is there a little series that you've been putting together on volunteer wheat control?
Absolutely. So there's a few things that places you can look. We've put together a series where we really dive into these topics about wheat-free windows, herbicide recommendations, some specifics on herbicides for volunteer management. We dive into the role of other hosts and other alternate hosts in the landscape, other crops, other grasses, other weeds in the eUpdate series. So please check that out. This week we put out an eUpdate about some of the trade-offs with variety resistance, right? So we've got this multi-part series where we've really dived into a lot of the questions producers have been asking us this year. On the 29th, we'll host two virtual webinars on wheat streak that are open to anybody, open to the public, where we'll have a number of specialists online. We'll go through some background on wheat streak mosaic management, some of the biology, some of the things we touched on here, and then we'll have a panel discussion, right? So we'll open it up for questions. So that's really the time you can come, ask your questions. We can have some discussion. We're doing that online, so we can kind of maximize the amount of people that can attend. So please join us in one of those sessions on the 29th. We'll have one 2 p.m. session if the daytime works better. We'll have one 7 p.m. session if you want to hop on after supper. So, look out for those links. That'll be on Tuesday, the 29th. And then you can catch us at pre-plant meetings. So we'll have several pre-plant meetings throughout the state in the month of August, where we'll also talk about wheat streak management and these topics as well.
Where can people find more information about those webinars?
You can check the Agronomy eUpdate. This week, we'll have the information there and the registration as well.
Kelsey, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Hey, thanks for having me, Shelby.
That was K-State wheat pathologist Kelsey Andersen Onofre. In today's show notes on agtoday.net, I will put a link to the Agronomy eUpdate article that discusses what a wheat-free week is, and I will also link the upcoming webinar if you'd like to tune in and listen to more about wheat streak mosaic virus. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Monday show talking with K-State Fisheries and Aquatics Extension Specialist Joe Gerken. Joe, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me back.
Joe, wanting to talk today about keeping ponds healthy, and why is this something that you've been getting a lot of questions about?
Yeah, so a lot of people are calling this time of year. Ponds do a lot of funny things in the summer, and so they can look funny, they can change colors. You can start to see things that maybe you don't see a lot of the time of the year. It's also been really warm outside, and so it's the time of year that people want to go out to these ponds and enjoy them, think about swimming, think about having kids swim in them, and they just want to make sure that it's safe for them to get into. But also, a lot of people have livestock, horses, things like that are drinking from the pond. They want to make sure that everything is safe for all these animals and for ourselves.
What is a common issue that usually cattle are the one creating?
The biggest issue that I see related to that would be, E. coli or fecal coliform would be a health risk that a lot of these livestock could introduce, especially when they have direct access to a pond. So if they're going into a pond, they're excreting their waste. A lot of times there can be some harmful bacteria with that. If we ingest that water accidentally, we're jumping, we're swimming, you get some up your nose. The bacteria levels can get inside your body and they can make you pretty sick. And so that would be one thing that you can test for, and we'd kind of want to make sure, hey, our bacteria levels aren't too high before we decide to start playing in that pond.
Is blue-green algae something people could see right now?
Yeah, that's another thing that we're starting to see with livestock concerns and blue-green algae. Most commonly it looks like paint swirls on top of the water, but it can come in a lot of different colors. It can be red, it can be brown, it can be little clumps. But by far that most common type of algae that we see just looks like paint smeared on the top. And if livestock or humans or wildlife ingest that can be a huge health risk too. So definitely if you see something like that, if there's something that looks funny about your pond, reach out and let's chat about it and see and make sure it's safe.
What's something that's rare in ponds, but you usually field quite a few questions about?
So every year there's a big news story about brain-eating amoebas, and I always get a bunch of phone calls right after that goes out. I call and say, hey, can you test my water for brain-eating amoebas and make sure it's safe? And the reality is, that we would have to test every bit of that water and make sure that there's not one amoeba in there. It's such a rare instance. It's not something that's going to be common. It's not something that we could safely or financially test for and say that it's safe. Even billionaires that had endless amounts of money couldn't test enough to make sure that there's no brain-eating amoebas. So very, very low risk. The news likes to get a story out of it. It's a headline that we see every year, but probably not a real risk that we need to worry about.
You've mentioned testing a few times. Is this testing once a year or maybe a couple times in the summer? What's best?
Yeah, it depends kind of on what makes you comfortable. People want to test their water and they want to make sure that it's safe. And a lot of times, what I recommend is maybe once or twice a year, kind of get baseline levels. Those fecal coliform levels can change drastically, but all of the water quality in a pond is changing even, every few minutes throughout the day. And depending on where we sample, it can make a difference. So we're kind of looking more for trends as opposed to, a blanket, everything safe or not safe.
What are a few things people can do to hopefully minimize health concerns in their ponds?
Yeah, I think keeping livestock out, if you're going to access it, is really important. Minimizing the amount of herbicides or pesticides that you're spraying near your pond can also be really important. So we're kind of trying to keep that water healthy. Keeping the water moving can also be really beneficial. So adding some aeration or somehow keeping that water from becoming stagnant can be really important.
What are the benefits of people taking care of their ponds and doing this testing?
Yeah, well, I think, there's a lot of benefits. It benefits the livestock. They're going to be happier. They're going to be healthier. They're going to drink more water, which we've talked about can lead to faster growth rates. It's great for wildlife. You're going to see more wildlife coming down to your pond and enjoying the pond, drinking the water, eating the vegetation that's in the pond if you enjoy the wildlife side of things. And then, obviously, if we're going in the water as humans, making sure that it's safe is something we definitely want to do.
And what is your top thing when it comes to pond safety?
Yeah, if you're really worried about being safe when you go to your pond, the one thing that you can definitely do that would help is wear a life jacket. So by far, that's what you should be concerned about a lot more than the water quality itself. So make sure you wear a life jacket if you're going to go swimming.
Joe, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thanks for having me.
That was K-State Fisheries and Aquatics Extension Specialist Joe Gerken. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.